In today's chilling episode, prepare to explore into the eerie tales that haunt the shadows. From a haunted church where a sinister priest lurks to soldiers facing an unseen horror in ancient ruins, these stories will keep you on the edge of your seat. Join us as we unravel the mysteries of possession and the supernatural. What truly lies in the dark? Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is. Let's connect over these terrifying experiences. Stay tuned, because you won't want to miss what happens next. The hidden darkness behind a friendly smile. Adam was the kind of student everyone noticed. Charismatic, talented, and seemingly well-liked by his peers, he had a natural ability to draw people in. His sketches were detailed and beautiful, filling his notebooks with intricate designs that seemed almost too advanced for someone his age. He was the type of student teachers loved, always polite, always helpful, and always handing out little gifts to his friends, usually candy. At first, the candy seemed like a simple gesture. Adam would casually hand out colorful wrapped sweets to his classmates during breaks, smiling as they accepted his gifts. He would say it was just a little something to brighten their day. No one thought much of it, and it quickly became part of the daily routine. Every day, a handful of students would receive their candy from Adam, and they would eat it without a second thought. But something about Adam had changed over the last few weeks, though most people hadn't noticed. He had become quieter, more withdrawn. His usual wide smile had faded, and his interactions with others became brief and distant. He still handed out candy, but now there was something different in his eyes, something darker. Jason, one of Adam's old friends, was among the few who had noticed the shift. They had been close once, hanging out after school, sharing art tips, and bonding over their love of comic books. But lately, Adam had become distant, especially after Jason started dating Sarah, Adam's ex-girlfriend. Their breakup had been amicable, or at least that's what everyone thought. But after Jason and Sarah began dating, Adam's behavior toward Jason changed. Adam stopped talking to Jason entirely. He became cold, staring at him from across the classroom with an intensity that made Jason feel uncomfortable. It wasn't open hostility, but the tension was clear. There was something unspoken, something brewing beneath the surface, but Jason chose to ignore it. He figured Adam was just dealing with the breakup in his own way. Still, the unease lingered. Jason often caught Adam watching him, his eyes filled with something that Jason couldn't quite place, resentment, maybe, or something even more unsettling. Then, one day, everything changed. It was an ordinary school day, and Jason had just finished his morning classes. The bell rang, and students began spilling out into the hallways. As he made his way toward the cafeteria, he overheard whispers, students talking in hushed voices. Something was happening. There was a commotion near the front office, and a few teachers were rushing past, their faces tight with worry. Curious, Jason followed the crowd. As he reached the office, he saw a group of students gathered around, talking nervously. A few of them mentioned Adam's name, but no one seemed to know exactly what had happened. Then, the rumors started to spread. Adam had been seen entering the office earlier that morning. He was supposed to meet with the principal, something about his declining behavior and a concern raised by one of his teachers. But what happened next was beyond anyone's imagination. The tension in the hallway grew thicker as more students gathered near the front office, their voices low and anxious. Jason pushed through the crowd, trying to hear more of what had happened. He caught snippets of conversation, people mentioning Adam's name and others whispering about something that had gone terribly wrong in the principal's office. It wasn't long before the details started to emerge, spreading through the school like wildfire. Adam had gone into the principal's office that morning for what was supposed to be a routine meeting. Mrs. Harper, the principal, had called him in to discuss concerns about his recent behavior. His teachers had noticed how he had grown more withdrawn, more distant. His grades were slipping, and the once charismatic student was becoming a shadow of himself. But no one could have predicted what happened next. According to the few who had been nearby, voices were raised inside the office. No one could make out the exact words, but something about the exchange sounded wrong. Then, in a horrifying turn of events, the shouting stopped, followed by the sound of a violent struggle. When the office staff rushed in, it was already too late. Mrs. Harper lay on the floor, and Adam was standing over her, holding the bloodied object he had used to end her life. The shock rippled through the school in waves. Teachers scrambled to contain the situation, ushering students back into classrooms and away from the chaos. The police were called, and within minutes, Adam was escorted out of the building in handcuffs. His face was emotionless, almost calm, as if the gravity of what he had just done hadn't registered. Jason stood frozen in the hallway, trying to process what he had just heard. It didn't seem real. How could Adam, the same guy who used to spend hours drawing superheroes and handing out candy, have done something so monstrous? The image of Adam being led away by the police played over and over in his mind, but it didn't make sense. The school was placed on lockdown, and the news spread quickly. By lunchtime, everyone knew what had happened. Whispers filled every corner of the building, speculation, disbelief, and fear. How had no one seen this coming? How had Adam gone from being the quiet, talented student everyone knew to committing such an unspeakable act? Jason sat with his friends in stunned silence, his thoughts racing. As much as he tried to push it out of his mind, one thought kept resurfacing. Was Adam's anger connected to him somehow? Ever since Jason had started dating Sarah, Adam had become more distant, more bitter. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, chalking it up to normal post-breakup tension. But now, Jason wasn't so sure. The pieces were starting to come together, and the picture they formed was far more terrifying than Jason had ever imagined. The days following the tragedy at school were a blur for Jason. The news of Mrs. Harper's death and Adam's arrest had sent shockwaves through the entire town. Parents were outraged, students were terrified, and no one could make sense of how something like this could have happened. Jason couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that Adam's anger had somehow been directed at him. It was a thought that festered in the back of his mind, growing stronger with each passing day. He remembered how Adam had started acting strangely ever since he began dating Sarah. Adam had cut off contact completely, and though Jason hadn't seen it as a big deal at the time, now it felt like more than just jealousy. It felt personal. One afternoon, Jason decided to visit Sarah. They hadn't seen much of each other since the incident, both trying to cope with the shock in their own ways. When he arrived at her house, she greeted him with a weary smile, and they sat on the porch, the tension between them heavy but unspoken. As they talked, Jason brought up the subject he had been avoiding. "Do you think Adam hated me because of us?" His voice was quiet, almost as if he didn't want to give the thought life by speaking it aloud. Sarah's face fell, her expression somber. "I don't know," she replied, her voice shaky. "Adam was different after we broke up. He wasn't angry at first, but I could tell something changed when you and I started seeing each other. He never said anything directly, but he'd give me these looks, like he was disappointed, or maybe hurt." Jason nodded, the pieces in his mind beginning to form a clearer picture. "I think it was more than that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think he blamed me. I keep remembering how he looked at me, like he wanted to say something but never did." Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with concern. "You don't think?" Jason shook his head, not wanting to finish the thought. But deep down, he knew what he was thinking, that maybe Adam's resentment had been festering for longer than anyone realized. Maybe it had been building up, and Mrs. Harper had just been caught in the crossfire of something much deeper. That night, as Jason lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Adam's transformation. It was as if the friend he once knew had vanished, replaced by someone consumed by darkness and bitterness. He replayed the events in his mind, wondering if there had been any signs he had missed. Could he have done something to prevent it? Could he have reached out to Adam before it was too late? But those questions went unanswered, leaving Jason with a growing sense of guilt and fear. The next day, the police released more information. Adam had been keeping journals, pages filled with drawings, notes, and disturbing thoughts. In one of those entries, Adam had written about his resentment toward Jason, blaming him for taking Sarah. The police had confirmed what Jason feared the most, Adam had been fixating on him for months. The revelation that Adam had been harboring resentment toward him hit Jason like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore, it was something darker, something Adam had allowed to consume him. The knowledge that his former friend had spiraled into violence over something as personal as a breakup weighed heavily on Jason. He couldn't shake the feeling that, in some way, Adam had been targeting him all along. The school remained tense in the following weeks. Everyone was on edge, and whispers of what Adam had written in his journal spread like wildfire. Jason avoided most conversations, unwilling to hear more speculation about Adam's motives. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the reality that he had been a central figure in Adam's growing anger. One afternoon, while Jason was sitting alone at home, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, asking if they could talk. She sounded worried, and her unease only deepened Jason's own sense of dread. He agreed to meet her at the park near her house, a quiet place where they had spent time together before everything had fallen apart. When Jason arrived, Sarah was already there, pacing nervously. She didn't waste any time. "Jason," she began, her voice shaking, "I think Adam was planning something bigger than what happened with Mrs. Harper. I've been thinking about everything, and I remembered, he used to talk about revenge. Not just against people who hurt him, but against anyone who crossed him." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice tense. Sarah hesitated, then pulled out a small notebook. "This was in his locker," she explained. "The police didn't find it because he left it with me a long time ago, saying it was just his sketches. But there's more in here. He wrote about you, Jason. About how you ruined everything for him, how he couldn't stand to see you happy with me." Jason took the notebook from her hands, his heart pounding as he flipped through the pages. There were drawings, dark, twisted images of people being hurt, their faces contorted in agony. And then there were the notes, scrawled in Adam's familiar handwriting. As Jason read, he felt the full weight of Adam's hatred crashing down on him. "I can't believe this," Jason whispered, staring at the pages filled with venomous thoughts. "He was going to come after me." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "I think Mrs. Harper was just the beginning. He had plans for you, too." Jason sat down on the park bench, overwhelmed. Everything he had feared was true. Adam's resentment had been festering for months, and Jason had been the target all along. If Adam hadn't been caught, if he hadn't been stopped. Jason didn't want to think about what could have happened. The notebook in his hands felt like a piece of Adam's darkness, a part of him that Jason would never be able to forget. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but the knowledge that he had been in Adam's sights left him feeling exposed, vulnerable. That night, as Jason lay in bed, the weight of it all finally settled in. Adam had been consumed by anger, and while the tragedy of Mrs. Harper's death would never leave the school, Jason knew he would carry his own burden of guilt and fear for a long time. The darkness Adam had unleashed wasn't something that would disappear with time. It was a scar that would remain, a reminder of how easily resentment could turn to violence. Unmasking the demon within the priest. When the Smith family first moved into the quiet neighborhood, they were eager to settle into their new lives. The house was perfect, nestled in a small community surrounded by trees, with a picturesque church just a few streets away. Life seemed peaceful, and for John, his wife Clara, and their two sons, Lucas, the eldest at 16, and Ethan, just 12, everything was falling into place. It wasn't long before they started attending the local church, St. Michael's, a small but welcoming place with a large stone building that stood tall in the middle of the town. The priest, Father Benedict, was known for his warm, inviting sermons, and the family felt right at home. But things changed the day an old man knocked on their door. John answered the door to find a thin, weary-looking man with graying hair and deep lines etched into his face. He introduced himself as Mr. Alvarez, one of the older residents of the town. His eyes, though tired, held a certain intensity as he leaned in closer to speak. His voice was low, almost as if he feared being overheard. Alvarez told John that there was something wrong with Father Benedict. He warned him that strange things had been happening at the church for years, people falling ill, seeing things that couldn't be explained, and hearing voices late at night. He claimed that the priest wasn't who he seemed to be, that something darker was controlling him. The warning was clear: stay away from St. Michael's. John, who didn't believe in supernatural stories, dismissed the man's words as superstitious nonsense. He thanked Alvarez for his concern but assured him that his family had no reason to be worried. After all, Father Benedict seemed like a kind man, and the church was a peaceful place. However, the warning stayed with Lucas. He had overheard the conversation from the top of the stairs and felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't say anything to his parents at the time, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. That Sunday, the Smith family returned to St. Michael's for Mass. Everything seemed normal at first. The church was filled with families, the stained glass windows casting soft, colorful light onto the pews. Father Benedict gave his usual sermon, but Lucas noticed something off about him. It was subtle, the way the priest's eyes seemed to linger a little too long on certain people, the odd, almost mocking tone in his voice. After Mass, John decided to confront Father Benedict about the rumors. The family approached the priest, and with a friendly but curious tone, John asked him about the strange warning they had received. Father Benedict's response was not what they expected. The priest let out a deep, unsettling laugh. He waved off the concerns, saying that the town's older residents had been spreading lies for years, fueled by other religious groups trying to undermine the church. His smile was wide, but Lucas felt his skin crawl. There was something about the way the priest laughed that didn't feel right. As they left the church, Lucas couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled over him. He knew something was wrong, and deep down, he feared that Mr. Alvarez's warning had been more than just an old man's superstition. As the days passed, Lucas couldn't stop thinking about Father Benedict. His laugh, the eerie tone in his voice, it all gnawed at Lucas's mind like an unsolved puzzle. He didn't want to worry his parents, but the warning from Mr. Alvarez echoed in his thoughts. Was it possible that the priest wasn't who he claimed to be? The idea seemed far-fetched, but Lucas couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something was wrong. One evening, Lucas decided to do some investigating on his own. He had always been curious by nature, and this situation was no different. He started by researching the history of St. Michael's Church. To his surprise, there wasn't much information available online. The few articles he found were basic, discussing the church's founding and a few events over the years, but nothing about the strange occurrences Mr. Alvarez had mentioned. Undeterred, Lucas decided to dig deeper. He began asking around the neighborhood, starting with some of the older residents. Many were reluctant to talk about Father Benedict or the church, but a few admitted they had heard unsettling rumors. Some said they had witnessed strange happenings at night, figures moving in the churchyard, shadows where there shouldn't have been any. One woman even claimed to have seen Father Benedict talking to himself late one night, as if he were having an argument with someone who wasn't there. Lucas's unease grew with every story. There was something off about the church, and it seemed like the whole town knew it, but chose to stay silent. It wasn't long before Lucas began to suspect that there was something darker at play, something paranormal. That weekend, Lucas convinced his younger brother Ethan to come with him to the church after dark. They waited until their parents were asleep before sneaking out of the house. The churchyard was eerily quiet as they approached, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. As they neared the church, Lucas noticed a light flickering inside. At first, he thought it might be a candle or some sort of reflection, but as they got closer, he realized it was coming from the altar. The light wasn't steady, it pulsed, almost like a heartbeat, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. Ethan grabbed Lucas's arm, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you see that?" he asked, his eyes wide with fear. Lucas nodded, his own heart pounding in his chest. They stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then, just as they were about to turn back, they heard it, a low, guttural voice coming from inside the church. It was deep and unnatural, nothing like the voice of Father Benedict they had heard during Mass. The voice seemed to reverberate through the air, sending a chill down Lucas's spine. They watched in horror as a figure emerged from the shadows behind the altar. It was Father Benedict, but something was different about him. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and his movements were slow, almost mechanical. Lucas and Ethan ducked behind a tombstone, their hearts racing. Lucas knew they had stumbled onto something far worse than he had imagined. Mr. Alvarez had been right all along. There was something deeply wrong with Father Benedict. The walk back home felt like an eternity for Lucas and Ethan. Every rustle of the leaves, every distant noise made them jump. The image of Father Benedict, with his glowing eyes and unnatural movements, played over and over in Lucas's mind. What had they just witnessed? Something inside the church was very wrong, and Lucas was sure now that it wasn't just a rumor. When they finally reached home, they sneaked back inside, trying to act normal in case their parents were still awake. But Lucas could see the fear in Ethan's eyes, reflecting the same dread that churned in his own stomach. That night, neither of them slept much. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was possessing Father Benedict was something dangerous, something evil. The next day, Lucas knew he had to tell his parents what they had seen. But how could he explain without sounding crazy? His father, John, had already dismissed Mr. Alvarez's warning as nonsense, so convincing him wasn't going to be easy. Still, Lucas felt a responsibility to protect his family from whatever was lurking in the church. After breakfast, Lucas pulled his parents aside and told them everything, what Mr. Alvarez had said, the stories he had heard from neighbors, and what he and Ethan had seen the night before. He expected his father to laugh it off or get angry, but instead, John's face grew serious. Clara, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. "Are you sure it wasn't just a trick of the light?" she asked, trying to make sense of what Lucas was telling them. But deep down, Lucas could see she was scared. The more he described the glowing eyes and the voice they had heard, the more she seemed to believe him. John finally spoke after a long pause. "I don't know what's going on, but if what you're saying is true, we need to be careful," he said, his tone heavy with concern. "Maybe it's time we had another talk with Father Benedict. If something's wrong, we need to figure it out." Lucas didn't know if confronting the priest again was the best idea, but he agreed. There was no way he was going back to that church alone, though. They decided that they would visit St. Michael's together after Mass the next day. The following Sunday, Lucas, Ethan, and their parents arrived at the church with an uneasy feeling. The Mass went on as usual, but Lucas could barely focus. Every word Father Benedict spoke felt off, every movement seemed strange. When the service ended, they waited until most of the congregation had left before approaching the priest. John spoke first, his voice steady but firm. "Father Benedict, there have been some concerns raised about you, and we want to get to the bottom of it." The priest's reaction was not what they expected. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted, almost mocking. "Concerns?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What kind of concerns?" Lucas's stomach turned as he watched the priest's eyes flicker, almost as if something dark was lurking just beneath the surface. "We've heard some things," John continued, undeterred. "And my son saw something strange last night." The priest's smile widened, and then he laughed, a deep, menacing sound that sent chills down Lucas's spine. "Ah, the rumors," Father Benedict said. "They always come from those who don't understand the power at play here." Lucas's heart raced. He knew then that they were standing face to face with something far more sinister than they had imagined. The tension in the room was thick as Father Benedict's laughter echoed through the church. Lucas could feel his heart pounding in his chest, and from the way his father clenched his fists, it was clear that John was trying to stay calm. Clara stood frozen beside them, her face pale as the reality of the situation sank in. "You don't understand," Father Benedict continued, his voice taking on a darker, more menacing tone. "What's happening here is beyond your comprehension. This church, this town, it belongs to something greater now." Lucas's stomach twisted. There was no mistaking the darkness behind the priest's words. Whatever was controlling Father Benedict wasn't human. The strange light in his eyes, the eerie tone of his voice, it all pointed to something demonic. John took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "We don't care what you're trying to do here," he said, his voice steady but filled with anger. "We're not going to let you harm this town, and we're certainly not going to let you harm our family." Father Benedict's smile twisted even further, his eyes narrowing into dark slits. "Harm?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Oh no, there's no harm here. Only enlightenment. Only the truth." But Lucas wasn't fooled. He could feel the darkness seeping out of the priest, the evil presence that had taken control. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about the church, it was about the power Father Benedict had tapped into, and it was dangerous. It was then that Ethan, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly stepped forward. "You're lying," he said, his voice steady but filled with fear. "We saw you last night. We saw what you really are." Father Benedict's expression shifted, the mocking tone gone in an instant. His eyes locked onto Ethan, and for a moment, the entire church seemed to darken. The temperature in the room dropped, and Lucas felt an icy chill crawl up his spine. "You saw nothing," the priest hissed, his voice now low and threatening. "Children should not meddle in things they don't understand." But Ethan didn't back down. He stepped closer to his father, his eyes never leaving the priest. "We know you're not human. We know you're possessed." The room fell into an oppressive silence. Father Benedict's face contorted, his smile now twisted into a sneer. The air grew heavier, and Lucas could feel the presence of something dark, something demonic, filling the room. For a moment, it seemed like Father Benedict would lash out, but then, in a swift motion, he turned away. "You're all fools," he muttered, his voice filled with contempt. "Leave now, before you regret ever stepping into this place." John didn't hesitate. He grabbed Ethan by the arm and motioned for Clara and Lucas to follow. They hurried out of the church, the sense of dread lifting slightly as they stepped into the open air. But Lucas knew that this wasn't over. Whatever had taken control of Father Benedict wasn't going to stop. It was only a matter of time before something worse happened. As they made their way home, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the church was still watching them, that the evil inside had taken root not just in the building, but in the town itself. And in the pit of his stomach, Lucas knew that this was only the beginning. Supernatural encounter during Iraq mission. The heat in the Iraqi desert was oppressive, even at dusk. Sergeant David Mitchell wiped the sweat from his brow as he scanned the barren landscape. The air was thick with dust, the horizon stretching endlessly under the fading sun. His squad, a group of hardened soldiers, was on patrol near an ancient set of ruins that had long been abandoned. The mission was routine: clear the area, report any signs of insurgent activity, but something about this location felt different. David had been through countless patrols during his time in the military, but the quiet that hung over this area was unsettling. There were no sounds of wildlife, no distant hum of village life, just silence. The ruins ahead stood like silent sentinels, their crumbling walls casting long shadows in the dying light. The team pressed forward, their movements methodical and cautious. Corporal Lewis, one of the younger soldiers, walked beside David, his eyes darting nervously between the ruins. "This place gives me the creeps," he thought. David couldn't disagree. Something about the ruins felt wrong. As they approached the entrance to the largest structure, a flash of light caught David's eye. It was quick, almost like a reflection of moonlight, but there was no moon visible yet. He stopped, signaling for the rest of the squad to halt. The others paused, their eyes following his gaze toward the ruins. Did anyone else see that? David wondered, his mind racing. The others kept their silence, but Corporal Lewis looked uneasy. He gave a nod, as if confirming the flash. Like a reflection, or maybe something else, crossed David's mind. The squad stood in silence for a moment, waiting for something to happen. But the light didn't return. David took a deep breath, trying to push away the growing sense of unease. It was probably nothing, just the light playing tricks on their eyes in the desert heat. They continued moving forward, but David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every step seemed heavier, every breath harder to take. The ruins loomed ahead, their darkened doorways like open mouths waiting to swallow them whole. As they rounded a corner near one of the larger structures, something caught David's eye again, a shadow moving quickly along the edge of a wall. This time, it wasn't just a flicker. It was a figure, tall, impossibly tall, with long, dark limbs that moved unnaturally fast. David's heart skipped a beat as he raised his hand, signaling for the squad to stop once more. Something's not right, he thought. The others gathered around, their weapons raised, their faces tense with confusion and fear. The figure was gone as quickly as it had appeared, vanishing into the shadows of the ruins. But the feeling of dread remained. David's instincts were screaming at him to turn back, to leave this place before something worse happened. But the mission wasn't over yet. The squad moved deeper into the ruins, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust that coated the ground. The air was still, thick with a silence that felt unnatural. David's senses were on high alert, every muscle in his body tensed as he scanned the dark corners and crumbling walls around them. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them from the shadows. Corporal Lewis walked just behind David, his hand gripping his rifle tightly. The rest of the squad fanned out, keeping a careful distance from each other as they surveyed the area. The ruins felt like a labyrinth, with narrow corridors and tall, jagged walls that seemed to close in around them the farther they went. Each turn brought a new wave of unease, a new feeling of being trapped in a place they didn't belong. As they moved toward the center of the ruins, David noticed something strange in the distance. A faint glow, pulsing gently, coming from deep within the crumbling walls ahead. It wasn't the warm, flickering light of a fire, but something colder, more artificial. His heart raced as he motioned for the squad to stop. They crouched behind the remnants of what had once been a stone wall, barely tall enough to offer any cover. The glow continued, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. David felt a chill crawl up his spine. He couldn't explain it, but there was something deeply wrong about that light. Lewis knelt beside him, his breath shallow. David didn't need to ask what his corporal was thinking, they both felt it. The air seemed to vibrate with an energy that wasn't natural, something otherworldly that clung to the ruins like a heavy fog. Without warning, the light flared brighter, casting sharp shadows across the ruined walls. David tensed, his hand hovering over his weapon. He expected something to emerge from the light, some explanation for the strange phenomenon. But nothing came. The light flickered and then faded, leaving only the suffocating darkness behind. The squad remained silent, their breaths shallow, waiting for any sign of movement. David strained to listen, but all he could hear was the faint rustling of the wind through the ruins. Still, the presence of something unseen weighed heavily on them. He could feel it in his bones, whatever it was, it hadn't left. David motioned for the squad to move forward again, but this time, every step felt heavier. The ruins seemed to close in around them, the darkness thickening with each passing moment. The air grew colder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, watching them, waiting. Then, out of the corner of his eye, David saw it again. The figure. Tall, impossibly tall, standing in the distance, barely visible in the faint moonlight that had begun to filter through the clouds. Its silhouette was dark, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, moving in a way that sent a chill down David's spine. The figure didn't move toward them, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, watching. David felt his heart race, his grip tightening on his weapon. He wanted to move, to leave, but something held him in place. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. The figure remained motionless, standing like a shadow against the night sky. David's heart pounded in his chest as he locked eyes with the distant silhouette, its presence heavy and oppressive. Every instinct in his body screamed to retreat, to get away from whatever this was, but the mission was still unfinished, and turning back now could mean jeopardizing everything. David signaled for the squad to keep moving, but slower now, more cautious. The figure didn't seem to follow them, but its lingering presence felt like a dark cloud hanging over the ruins. Corporal Lewis shot nervous glances over his shoulder as they advanced, clearly unsettled by the encounter. The rest of the squad stayed silent, their faces tense, their movements stiff with fear. As they ventured deeper into the ruins, the air grew colder, the darkness thicker. It was as if the ruins themselves were alive, swallowing them whole, pulling them into something far darker than any battlefield they had known. David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into a trap, something they didn't understand. They rounded a corner, and the faint glow from earlier returned. This time, it was different. The light wasn't distant, it was closer, almost tangible, as if it were seeping from the very stones around them. The squad paused, their breaths shallow, as the light pulsed gently, casting eerie shadows across the jagged walls. David motioned for them to spread out, each soldier taking up a defensive position behind whatever cover they could find. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the pulsing light and the thick silence that pressed in from all sides. Lewis shifted beside him, his voice low but steady. He was trying to keep calm, but David could sense the fear creeping into his words. It wasn't just the ruins that were unsettling them, it was the sense that they weren't alone. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. A low, guttural noise, almost like a growl, echoed through the ruins. David froze, his heart pounding in his ears. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the walls themselves were alive, whispering in a language they couldn't understand. He glanced at the others, and they all had the same look of dread on their faces. Then, from the shadows, the figure appeared again. It wasn't standing still this time. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, its limbs impossibly long, its face hidden in the darkness. The way it moved was wrong, unnatural, as if it were gliding across the ground without making a sound. David's breath caught in his throat. The figure wasn't just tall, it was towering, its form stretching unnaturally high above them. The air grew colder still, and with every step the figure took, the temperature seemed to drop even further. Lewis raised his weapon, but David quickly motioned for him to hold fire. Shooting at something they didn't understand could make things worse. The squad stayed frozen, watching as the figure stopped just a few yards away, standing at the edge of the pulsing light. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure vanished, swallowed by the shadows. David's pulse raced, his mind spinning. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. And it wasn't gone, it was watching, waiting, just out of sight. The sense of dread grew heavier, and David knew they had to get out of there before it was too late. The moment the figure disappeared, the squad stood frozen in place, their hearts pounding with fear. David's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The figure, the pulsing light, the unnatural cold, none of it made any sense. But one thing was clear, they needed to leave, and they needed to leave now. David signaled to the squad, his movements sharp and urgent. They moved quickly, sticking close to the crumbling walls of the ruins as they began their retreat. The oppressive silence that had filled the air earlier was now replaced by a low, steady hum, almost like the sound of electricity buzzing just beneath the surface. It felt like the ruins themselves were alive, pulsing with an energy that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Corporal Lewis stayed close to David, his eyes wide with fear. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. The rest of the squad was just as tense, their movements quick and cautious as they made their way out of the ruins. The temperature continued to drop, and David's breath came out in shallow puffs of fog. The cold wasn't natural, he knew that much. It clung to them like a shroud, thick and suffocating. His mind kept replaying the image of the towering figure, its long limbs, the way it moved silently through the darkness. Whatever it wasn't just some hallucination. It was real. As they neared the edge of the ruins, the pulsing light behind them began to fade, but the sense of dread didn't. David could feel it, still watching them, lurking just out of sight. Every instinct in his body told him to run, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic would only make things worse. The squad finally reached the outskirts of the ruins, and the barren desert stretched out before them. The oppressive silence lifted slightly, but the fear remained. David glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the ruins, watching them go. But there was nothing, just the crumbling walls, dark and silent under the night sky. They didn't stop moving until they were far enough from the ruins to feel safe. When they finally paused to catch their breath, David could see the exhaustion and fear etched into the faces of his men. No one spoke for several minutes, the only sound being their labored breathing and the faint rustling of the wind through the sand. David knew he had to say something, but words felt hollow in the face of what they had just experienced. How could he explain the unexplainable? How could he make sense of something that defied all logic? Corporal Lewis finally broke the silence, his voice shaky but determined. He wasn't sure what they had encountered back there, but it wasn't something they could explain away. David nodded in agreement. Whatever was lurking in those ruins was something beyond their comprehension, something ancient and dark that had no place in the world they knew. As they began the long trek back to base, the weight of the encounter hung over them like a dark cloud. They had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't just war, this was something far more terrifying. David knew one thing for sure, they wouldn't speak of what they had seen. Not to their superiors, not to anyone. Some things were better left in the dark. Explosion panic, what really happened? It was an ordinary morning at Pine Grove High School. The students filled the hallways, chatting, laughing, and making their way to class as the bell rang to start the day. For Ethan, a sophomore, it was just another Wednesday. He walked with his friends toward their first period class, ready for another typical day of assignments and lessons. The sun was shining, the air was warm, and everything felt routine. But that routine was shattered in an instant. Halfway through his English class, just as Ethan was beginning to tune out the teacher's lecture, a sudden, deafening sound shook the building. It was so loud, so unexpected, that it felt like the walls themselves were trembling. The sound echoed through the hallways, followed by a strange, heavy silence, as if the entire school was holding its breath. The students in Ethan's class froze. For a moment, no one moved. Everyone sat, wide-eyed, staring at one another in confusion. Was it an explosion? A crash? Ethan's heart raced as he tried to process what had just happened. He exchanged a nervous glance with his best friend, Luke, who sat across the room, looking just as startled. The teacher's face went pale, and she quickly told everyone to stay calm, though the tension in her voice betrayed her fear. The usual noise of the school was gone, replaced by the distant, faint hum of murmurs from students and teachers trying to figure out what had just happened. For Ethan, the silence was almost worse than the noise itself. It hung in the air like a dark cloud, filled with uncertainty. Ethan couldn't help but think back to all the stories he'd heard in the news, about dangerous incidents in schools, about students not being safe where they should be. The fear was immediate, gripping him like a vice. Was this another one of those situations? Was the school in danger? He glanced toward the window, half expecting to see smoke or something worse. But everything outside looked normal, untouched by the chaos happening inside. Yet, that didn't ease the tension that filled the room. The students were visibly shaken, some whispering among themselves, others pulling out their phones to check for any news or messages. Suddenly, an announcement came over the loudspeaker. The principal's voice, shaky but trying to maintain control, instructed everyone to remain in their classrooms until further notice. No one knew what had happened yet, but the school was on high alert. The uncertainty was agonizing. Ethan could feel his pulse quicken as he stared at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The day had started so normally, but now, everything felt off. Fear prickled the back of his neck as he wondered what kind of danger might be lurking outside their classroom. And then came the whispers. Someone had heard it was an explosion. Others speculated it was an accident in the chemistry lab. Rumors began to swirl, feeding the growing sense of panic in the room. But no one really knew the truth. Not yet. As the minutes stretched on, the atmosphere in the classroom grew increasingly tense. Ethan could feel the weight of fear pressing down on everyone. The loud bang that had rattled the school was still fresh in everyone's minds, and the uncertainty of what had caused it was making the situation worse. Across the room, students were glued to their phones, hoping for updates. Some were texting their parents, others scrolling through social media, searching for any hint of what might have happened. But the longer they waited, the more panicked the whispers became. Ethan overheard one of the students at the back of the room saying they had heard it was a bomb. Another claimed they saw someone run out of the building right after the explosion. Ethan's mind raced. Could it really have been a bomb? The idea seemed impossible, but the fear that clung to the room made it feel all too real. He glanced over at Luke, who was sitting tensely with his phone in hand. The look on Luke's face told Ethan that he was thinking the same thing. They didn't know what was going on, and that made everything worse. The teacher tried to regain control of the room, raising her voice over the growing hum of anxious conversations. She reminded everyone to stay calm, but her own nerves were showing. She paced by the door, occasionally peeking out into the hallway, hoping for an update. But there was no news, just the heavy silence that had descended over the entire school. Ethan's thoughts drifted to his family. He thought about texting his mom, but something stopped him. He didn't want to worry her, not until he knew what was happening. But the fear gnawing at his stomach was hard to ignore. The unknown made everything feel more dangerous. Suddenly, there was a noise from outside the classroom. Everyone jumped, their heads snapping toward the door. It was just the sound of footsteps, someone running down the hallway. But in the current atmosphere, even something as normal as that felt like a threat. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the footsteps grew louder, only to fade again into the distance. The room was on edge. Some of the students were starting to panic openly now, their voices growing louder, the fear in their words contagious. Ethan could feel the panic rising in himself too, a gnawing dread that made his hands shake. He wanted to know what was happening, but he was also terrified of the answer. Then, without warning, the door to the classroom opened, and the principal stepped inside. Her face was tight with worry, and she quickly told the teacher something in a low voice. The room fell silent as everyone strained to hear what was being said. The tension was unbearable. The teacher turned to the class, her voice more steady now as she addressed them. There had been an incident, she explained, but no one was hurt. The school was still investigating what had caused the loud noise, and until they knew more, everyone was to stay in their classrooms. Ethan felt a small flicker of relief at the words "no one was hurt," but the fear hadn't fully gone away. What had caused the explosion? And why hadn't they figured it out yet? The minutes dragged on, and though the principal's words had offered some reassurance, the tension in the classroom remained. The students, though slightly calmer, still whispered nervously, their imaginations running wild with possibilities. Ethan leaned against the wall, trying to stay composed, but the unease in the room was impossible to ignore. Suddenly, the classroom door opened again, and this time, one of the security guards stepped in. He spoke quietly to the teacher before turning to the class. There was a seriousness in his expression, but also a touch of relief. The situation was under control, he explained, and they had discovered the source of the explosion. A group of senior students had been behind it. Ethan felt his stomach drop. What? The security guard continued, explaining that it hadn't been a real explosion at all, it was a prank gone terribly wrong. The seniors, in a reckless attempt to create a spectacle, had set off a massive firework with an improvised fuse near the back of the school. The sound of the firework had echoed through the building, making it seem far worse than it actually was. Thankfully, no one had been hurt, but the chaos it had caused was undeniable. The room erupted into a mixture of disbelief and anger. Some students laughed nervously, trying to shake off the tension they had been feeling for the past hour. Others, like Ethan, felt a deep sense of frustration. A prank? He couldn't believe it. They had all been terrified, thinking the worst, because of a stupid, dangerous joke. Luke, sitting beside Ethan, let out a low whistle. "I can't believe it was just fireworks," he muttered under his breath. Ethan nodded, but he didn't feel much like talking. The adrenaline that had been coursing through him was beginning to wear off, leaving him feeling drained. The security guard instructed the teacher to keep the class calm as the situation continued to be handled. The school was still on lockdown until everything was sorted out, and the pranksters had been identified and taken into custody. They were already facing serious consequences, the guard said, and the administration wasn't taking the situation lightly. Ethan's mind was racing. How could the seniors have been so reckless? Setting off fireworks in a school was beyond stupid, it was dangerous. What if someone had gotten hurt in the panic? What if the prank had led to something far worse? He felt a simmering anger toward those students, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the relief that it wasn't something more serious. As the minutes ticked by, the school remained tense, but the fear was slowly being replaced by frustration. Ethan could hear students in the back of the room complaining about how idiotic the prank had been, while others just sat in silence, trying to process the day's events. The firework prank had caused chaos, sending the entire school into a state of panic and uncertainty. The fear had been real, the danger had felt real, and for a brief moment, everyone had believed something far worse was happening. But now, all that was left was the anger and relief that it had only been a prank. A dangerous, foolish prank. As the truth about the prank spread through the school, a mix of emotions settled over everyone. The initial fear that had gripped the students and teachers was giving way to frustration, disbelief, and for some, lingering unease. While no one had been hurt, the impact of the incident was undeniable. Ethan sat quietly at his desk, trying to process everything. The fear he had felt just an hour ago still lingered in the back of his mind, and though he was relieved that the situation hadn't been as dangerous as they'd all feared, the fact that it had been a prank made him feel uneasy. How could a group of students have thought something like this was a good idea? The classroom buzzed with conversation as students vented their frustration. Some were still shaken, their voices filled with anger as they talked about the seniors who had pulled the prank. Others were already laughing about it, trying to brush off the tension by making jokes. But for Ethan, the whole event had left a sour taste. He had genuinely believed something terrible was happening. They all had. The announcement system crackled to life once more, and the principal's voice came over the speakers. Her tone was calm but stern, addressing the entire school about the incident. She confirmed that the pranksters had been caught and would be facing disciplinary action, but her message was clear: this wasn't just a harmless joke. The panic it had caused was real, and the consequences could have been much worse. As the principal spoke, Ethan's thoughts drifted to the moments of fear he had experienced earlier, the uncertainty, the tension, the way time had seemed to stretch out as he waited for something awful to happen. Even though he knew it had just been a prank, the fear he had felt was still real. The pounding of his heart, the sinking feeling in his stomach, it wasn't something he could easily forget. The lockdown was lifted, and slowly, the students were allowed to leave their classrooms. As Ethan walked through the hallways with Luke by his side, the atmosphere felt different. The usual noise and chaos of the school day had been replaced by quiet conversations and a sense of disbelief. Some students were on their phones, texting their parents or sharing what had happened on social media, while others just looked relieved that it was finally over. Luke nudged Ethan as they made their way to their lockers. "Well, that was the dumbest prank I've ever heard of," he muttered. Ethan nodded, though he couldn't bring himself to laugh about it. The entire day had left him feeling drained. "Yeah," Ethan finally said, "but it's scary how fast things can go from normal to that." Luke gave him a thoughtful look but didn't say anything in response. The weight of the day's events hung between them as they gathered their things and prepared to leave. As Ethan walked home that afternoon, the sun shining brightly overhead, the sense of normalcy began to return. But the fear that had gripped him earlier still lingered in the back of his mind. He realized how quickly things could change, how a normal day could turn into something terrifying with no warning. The prank had ended, the danger had passed, but the memory of that fear would stay with him for a long time. The day fear took over our school. It was a normal day at Maplewood High, and the students in Mr. Harris's geography class were going through the usual routine. The room was filled with the soft hum of students whispering to each other as Mr. Harris outlined the next project on the whiteboard. Maps of continents hung on the walls, and the atmosphere was relaxed. For David, a junior who sat near the window, this was just another day to get through, another class to sit through until the bell rang. David had never been one to enjoy geography. His mind often wandered during class, But today, something felt different. The air in the classroom was heavier than usual, as if a strange tension had settled over the building. He tried to focus on the notes in front of him, but the feeling of unease gnawed at him. He glanced at the clock, counting down the minutes until the end of the period. Without warning, the loudspeakers crackled to life. The voice of the principal, Mrs. Owens, came through, but instead of the usual morning announcements or reminders about upcoming events, her tone was serious, almost frantic. The words she said froze the entire room. "Attention all students and staff. We are now in lockdown. This is not a drill." The classroom erupted into chaos. Desks scraped against the floor as students looked around in confusion, fear quickly spreading across their faces. Mr. Harris acted quickly, gesturing for everyone to move to the back of the room, away from the windows. His voice was calm, but David could see the tension in his eyes. David's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched down with the others, his back pressed against the cold wall. The classroom that had felt so familiar moments ago now seemed like a cage. The blinds were drawn, and the lights turned off, casting the room into a dim, shadowy silence. No one knew what was happening. Whispers spread through the room like wildfire. Some students speculated it was just a drill gone wrong, while others feared the worst, a shooter inside the school. David didn't want to believe it, but the dread settling in his stomach told him otherwise. He clutched his phone, debating whether to text his parents, but his hands were shaking too much to type. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every creak of the building, every distant noise outside the classroom sent waves of anxiety through the group. Mr. Harris tried to keep the students calm, whispering reassurances, but it was clear that no one knew what was really happening. David's mind raced. He had seen news reports about school shootings, heard stories from other parts of the country, but it had always seemed distant, something that could never happen here. Not in his school, not in his town. But now, with the weight of the unknown pressing down on him, it was all too real. The classroom had fallen into an eerie, suffocating silence. Every student was huddled together near the back wall, their breaths barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might attract something, or someone, outside. David sat with his knees pulled up to his chest, his heart racing so fast he felt like it might leap out of his throat. The room felt smaller now, claustrophobic, with the fear pressing in on everyone. Mr. Harris had stationed himself near the door, his body tense as he listened for any sign of what was happening in the hallway. The blinds were tightly shut, casting the room in a murky gray light that only added to the sense of isolation. Occasionally, a floorboard creaked, or the ventilation system hummed, and each sound seemed to slice through the stillness like a knife. David's phone buzzed softly in his pocket. He carefully pulled it out, glancing at the screen. His mother had texted him. "Are you okay? What's happening at the school?" He quickly typed a response with trembling fingers, trying to keep it short and calm. "We're in lockdown. I don't know what's going on." He hit send and then stared at the screen, waiting for another message, some reassurance that everything would be fine. But as the minutes dragged on, his phone remained silent. The only thing David could hear was the shallow breathing of his classmates and the occasional stifled sob from one of the younger students. The tension in the room grew heavier with each passing moment. No one dared to speak out loud anymore. A few kids exchanged glances, their wide eyes betraying their fear, but for the most part, everyone stayed completely still. David tried to keep his mind from spiraling, focusing on the patterns of the tiles on the floor, counting them over and over again, as if it might help calm his nerves. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed down the hallway, a sharp, metallic crash followed by hurried footsteps. David's heart skipped a beat, and the entire class stiffened in unison. The sound seemed to come closer, growing louder, as if someone was running past the classroom door. His mind raced with possibilities. Was it the police? Another student? Or something far worse? Mr. Harris raised a hand, signaling for everyone to stay quiet. David held his breath, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. The footsteps faded into the distance, and the oppressive silence returned. But the fear didn't leave. If anything, it deepened, clawing at David's chest. He realized then that the not knowing, the uncertainty, was almost as terrifying as the thought of what might be happening outside the classroom. The sense of helplessness gnawed at him. They were stuck, with no idea what was going on just outside their door, and all they could do was wait. David stared at the clock on the wall. Time seemed to crawl, each minute stretching longer than the last. The fear settled in his bones, and he couldn't help but wonder how much longer they'd be trapped in this nightmare. Time moved painfully slowly as David sat on the floor, his back pressed against the wall. His legs had begun to cramp, but the fear in his chest kept him frozen in place. The tension in the classroom was almost unbearable, each of his classmates sitting stiffly, barely moving, their faces pale with fear. Every small sound outside seemed amplified, as if the school itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the buzz of a phone cut through the silence. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the room, it felt deafening. One of the students near the back quickly pulled out their phone, reading the message before turning to whisper it to the person next to them. In seconds, the quiet room was filled with hushed murmurs, small fragments of conversation passing between the students like wildfire. David could feel the ripple of anxiety spreading, and he strained to hear what was being said. Bits of the conversation reached him, rumors about a gunman, about someone getting into the school. One student whispered that they had heard there were shots fired near the cafeteria. Another claimed the police were already inside, searching the halls. But no one knew for sure. The uncertainty made everything worse. David's own phone buzzed again. He checked the message. It was his mom. "Stay safe. Police are responding." Her words offered little comfort. He felt more disconnected than ever, trapped inside the classroom with no real idea of what was happening just beyond the door. Were they safe? Or was danger just a few steps away? The longer they sat in silence, the more his mind spiraled, imagining the worst possible scenarios. Mr. Harris, who had remained calm up to this point, finally broke the silence. He whispered to the students closest to him, his voice steady but laced with tension. "We don't know what's happening, but we need to stay quiet and stay here until we get more information. Everyone needs to remain calm." His words helped a little, but only briefly. The rumors still swirled through the room, feeding the fear that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. David couldn't help but think of his friends in other classrooms. Were they safe? Were they just as scared as he was right now? The thought of anyone he knew being in danger made his chest tighten. As he sat there, time dragged on endlessly. The uncertainty was suffocating. He wanted to believe that the lockdown was just a precaution, that maybe the situation wasn't as serious as it seemed. But then, why hadn't anyone come to give them more information? Why were they still stuck in this classroom, waiting for something to happen? The silence was interrupted again, this time by a faint sound coming from the hallway. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. David's heart raced. Mr. Harris gestured for everyone to stay quiet, his body tense as he moved closer to the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside the classroom. Everyone held their breath, waiting, listening. Then, nothing. The footsteps continued down the hall, leaving the room in its eerie silence once again. David's fear only deepened, the uncertainty hanging over them like a dark cloud. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Every student sat frozen, eyes wide with fear as they waited for the footsteps to return, for something, anything, to happen. David's hands were clammy, his heart still racing from the unknown figure that had passed just outside their door. His body felt heavy with fear, but he couldn't move, couldn't breathe deeply. The weight of uncertainty was too much. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the silence was broken. A knock came at the classroom door, soft but unmistakable. Mr. Harris stood quickly, his face a mixture of anxiety and determination. He motioned for everyone to stay put as he cautiously approached the door. David's breath caught in his throat. Every muscle in his body tensed as Mr. Harris reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a police officer standing on the other side. Relief flooded the room in an instant. the officer's calm demeanor brought a wave of reassurance that washed over the terrified students. The lockdown was over. Everyone let out the breath they had been holding, though the fear still lingered. The officer quickly explained that the situation had been contained. There had been no shooter inside the school, but a threat had been made, and the lockdown was put in place as a precaution. Shots had been fired nearby, but no one in the school had been hurt. As the students began to stir, standing shakily to their feet, David remained seated for a moment longer. He had been holding on to the fear for so long that even the words "it's over" felt unreal. His body was still tense, his mind still trapped in the intensity of the past few hours. It felt like a dream, a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from, even though the danger was gone. Slowly, the students were escorted out of the classroom and through the hallway. David's legs felt weak as he walked past the other classrooms, seeing the pale faces of his friends and teachers, each of them marked by the same terror he had experienced. The reality of the lockdown began to sink in. While no one had been physically hurt, the psychological toll was clear. The fear had left its mark. As David stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, it felt wrong. The world outside the school continued as if nothing had happened, but David knew he would never see things the same way again. The noise of the traffic, the rustling of the wind, it all felt distant, as if he was still trapped inside the classroom, waiting for something terrible to happen. The weeks that followed were filled with endless conversations about the lockdown, with students and teachers trying to make sense of the fear that had gripped them. But for David, the experience had left something deeper, a sense of vulnerability that he couldn't shake. Every loud noise, every unexpected sound brought him back to that moment in the classroom, where the fear had been so thick it felt like it was suffocating him. David knew that the trauma of that day would stay with him. The fear, the helplessness, the uncertainty, it was something he would carry long after the school returned to normal. The lockdown might have ended, but the memory of it, the feeling of being trapped with no control, would haunt him for years to come. As we draw the curtains on tonight's haunting tales, remember the chilling figures that lurked in the shadows, from the sinister priest to the terrifying presence in the ruins. Each story serves as a reminder that darkness can creep into our lives when we least expect it. Which story gripped you the most? Do you have a terrifying experience to share with us? We want to hear your stories. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up, it truly helps our channel grow. Don't forget to check out our other videos for more spine-chilling adventures. Stay safe out there.